Next up, we have my favorite regulator, Dr. Brian King. I always joke with Dr. King about this, but I think it is worth saying in a global setting that being the head of the FDA CTP is probably one of the hardest jobs in any civil service anywhere. It must always feel like even when you make the best decision, you're going to make someone upset. Dr. King has shouldered this burden with aplomb since he started, which was only a few months prior to his first address at Gtnf in Washington, D.C. Before taking up the big chair at CTP, Dr. King served at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where he was editor of Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, and he is the editor and author of multiple Surgeon General's reports. One thing you may not know about Dr. King is his commitment to addressing the impact of health disparities on historically disadvantaged communities. This spans LGBTQ+ communities to Native Americans, poor youth, and the Black and Hispanic communities in the U.S. Dr. King has been leading a tireless effort at CTP to elevate and amplify the voices of those who are so seldom heard, and his office is now engaging in significant outreach to that effect. I really admire this focus, especially in the face of the day-to-day challenges inherent in running a massive government agency dealing in a controversial industry. It is indicative of the very best you see in civil service, and not a surprise to anyone who has gotten to know Dr. King during his tenure. So Dr. King, I invite you to come on up and give us your address.
Great, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. It's all true, folks, and I'll add that I did it before my first colonoscopy. It's supposed to be a joke, tough room. So, pleasure to be here, folks. I think this is the third Gtnf that I have spoken at. A pleasure to be here. It's been a bit of a whirlwind travel week for me. Last week I was at speaking at a Best Western in Helena, Montana, and here we are on the shores of the Mediterranean. So you all certainly know to pick a good venue and a good location. So always happy to attend. Since the last time I was here, we have released a 5-year strategic plan at the Center for Tobacco Products at FDA, and so today I'd like to focus on that, including all of the recent developments with regard to that plan, which I am sure of interest to this group, and then we'll also have time at the end for some Q&A as well. So for folks who aren't aware, these are the 5 main pillars of that strategic plan. It was released last December after several months of engagement, including a public meeting with folks from industry, as well as public health and others. And after that process, which also included engagement within the center, we came with these 5 major goal areas. And so I'm going to walk through each of these 5 with some kernels of information on different status of each. I'll also note that as part of the strategic plan, we also had cross-cutting themes, all very important components. These interestingly also align with the 4 pillars of interest when I took this position in terms of key areas that were important to me, including robust science, health equity, of course, is very important to me, as was appropriately noted by Chris, as well as stakeholder engagement, and finally, transparency. The last one was very key. That was a word that showed up prominently in an external evaluation that I was gifted a mere weeks after my assuming this role, and it's something that we're working on very diligently in terms of transparency, not only with the content that we deliver, but how we deliver that information in terms of mechanism and also speed with which we do so. So we've been making a lot of important inroads, but there's still a ways to go, and you'll see all 4 of these cross-cutting themes infiltrated across the 5 objective areas. So the first objective area really focuses on developing, advancing, and communicating comprehensive and impactful tobacco regulations and guidance. So as everyone knows, I did not write the Tobacco Control Act, but I am in charge of implementing it, and as a result of that, it is a compendium of a variety of different things that we are required to do by law, and that includes also the potential to do rulemakings and guidance, which is also a very tortured bureaucratic process. Again, I didn't write it, but I am in charge of implementing it, and so as part of this, we have finite resources, and we have to balance what we are going to do in the short and long term. And so as a part of this new strategic plan, we have developed a policy agenda, which is posted online. It will continue to be updated on an annual basis. And we've developed both short and long-term objectives. Everything can't be a priority. We're never going to get it done. And so as a result of this process, we have developed these current priorities as well as long-term priorities. I will remind folks that we are also part of the executive branch of the U.S. government. And so as a result of that, priorities can stem from given administrations, but I am very hopeful that we'll continue to prioritize public health and making the biggest impact possible, including efforts to reduce death and disease from combustible tobacco product use. That said, in terms of current priorities, you see several rules on there that are getting at that. I'm going to walk through a few in the next ensuing slides, but we also have some longer-term priorities as well. And so the goal is to update this annually and to continue to make routine updates on the web as priorities change, which can, and I think we've got a few examples of that in the next few slides. First one that we recently issued, just of interest to this group, especially as we're talking about retailers, is Tobacco 21. We did just finalize this rule. The final components will go into effect by the end of this month. You recall that this initially was legislation that was passed several years ago, co-championed by Mitch McConnell and Tim Kaine. And so if they can agree on something, there is hope, folks. And so our goal was to finalize this, and we did. And there's a few key components that go into effect at the end of the month, including those that increases the age at which retailers must ID, which went from 27 to 30, and also prohibition on tobacco products in vending machines unless the venue is 21 plus. And so these will finalize that rulemaking process and again be in effect at the end of the year. We also continue to work on the product standards. And so menthol in cigarettes and also flavored in cigars. I've said this publicly before. FDA continues to be committed to make sure that we get these to the finish line as expeditiously as possible. We are following the rulemaking process prescribed by law, and we submitted these to the White House Office of Management and Budget approximately 1 year ago. Our hope is that these will move forward, and they'll continue to be a priority for FDA in the interim. We also continue to work on a proposed rule on capping nicotine in cigarettes and certain other combustible products. We continue to work on this proposed rule, and the goal is for this to be released as well. So stay tuned on all three of these, but they continue to be a priority for the FDA. We also continue to work on what I call foundational rules, and this is the tobacco product manufacturing standard, and this proposed rule was released last year, and then we also had a public oral hearing and a TIPSAC meeting, and the comment period closed last fall. This, I think, is very important because I could see a lot of rules stemming from this, and so I frequently remind folks, although I get a lot of flack for it, that our center is relatively young. We are 15 years old. We have other centers at FDA that are over 100 years old, and so they have had the luxury of time to implement foundational rules. We're still in that stage at CTP, and the process takes many years. It involves public comment, which I think is a good thing, to make sure we get people's feedback, but it also takes time. And so we've been working at this for many years, and I'm very hopeful that once we finalize this rule, we could see several other rules stemming from that now that we have that strong foundation. And also, here's an oldie but a goodie. And so I said priorities can change. We recently had a big win in the Fifth Circuit on the First Amendment grounds, so there's a chance for everything, folks. And there was a favorable decision for FDA with regard to health warning labels for cigarettes. And so as a result, the rule has now been effective, and FDA is proceeding forward with it. And so we recently issued guidance earlier this month for industry in terms of enforcement, and we're looking at the end of 2025 in terms of that enactment date. And so this is one of many rules, as well as others, that continue to move forward, and we're prioritizing our efforts towards those that are going to have the most impactful effect on public health. And of course, this would be one, given that cigarette smoking is the leading cause of preventable disease and death in this country. So now moving on to goal area 2, this is ensuring timely, clear, and consistent product application review. And so this is one where we've made some inroads. I think there's a lot more opportunity, particularly as we get through the bolus of applications that we've received. I'm sure you've seen this slide before. There is a slight change since you've probably seen it before in terms of authorizations. And so we're now up to 34 over the past couple months. 1/3 of that number came during that time period. And so we continue to review the applications. We have now taken action on more than 26 million applications. We've received nearly 27 million. There's a couple 100,000 that remain in the queue. We also recently filed our latest report in terms of the American Academy of Pediatrics lawsuit in terms of high market share products. We have completed 99.5% of those. There's one application remaining as we filed with the court, and we're going to continue to prioritize completion of those as well as getting through this bolus of applications. And I will say what I've said again, that we're not going to jeopardize the science, and we also need to make sure that our actions are legally defensible, and that takes time. And so I'm hopeful we're getting to a point where we will get through that bolus, and we will get closer and closer to a fully regulated marketplace, but we've got to make sure that we do this right, and the proof from these authorizations is things can get authorized, including flavored e-cigarettes, which I've spoken to this group. I remember Q&A where folks pressed saying we had a de facto ban on these products, and I said vehemently then that we did not, and now, as you can see, that is true. But people need to step up to the plate and bring sufficient science to meet that standard. We've been very clear about what was needed. You can now see that it is possible, but it's critical that you bring the science to support it. That said, we did issue marketing granting orders for the first menthol-flavored products, and we also recently had an authorization for a higher market share product, Vuse Alto, the tobacco flavor as well. So we continue to make progress. There will be more authorizations in the future, but again, onus is on industry to really step up to the plate and continue to develop and submit strong science, and also thinking of innovative ways to continue to curb youth use of these products. In terms of other application pathways, we have many. Kathy appropriately noted that there's multiple pathways, including SE, that tends to get a lot of attention around combustibles. Again, I didn't write the law, I am in charge of implementing it, and so that is what we are going to do. I don't look good in orange, folks, so we're going to make sure we follow the law. This is the latest status in terms of substantial equivalence, but we also have the X pathway as well, and of course the modified risk tobacco product application pathway as well. We continue to get applications, continue to review and work across all those pathways. But again, when you've got finite resources, you have to prioritize what you do have. We continue to ramp up staff levels. I'll talk about that bit in a bit, but I think we're making good progress, and I'm hopeful for the future in terms of continuing to identify ways to synergize, identify efficiencies, and get through those applications and get to what I hope is a steady state. We're always going to receive applications, so people tell me, well, when are you going to be finished with the applications? And the answer to that is never, because I would hope there's going to continue to be innovation, and so we're going to continue to get products, but the goal is to get within the 180 statutory deadline prescribed by Congress. So also focusing on applications, we continue to get a lot of attention around the need for transparency, and so a result of that, we did release a new searchable tobacco product database with one of the key audiences being retail sector. We are getting a lot of queries around what can we legally sell, and so we did compile this searchable database, which has a broad universe, and we do update that regularly for both e-cigarettes, but also other products as well. We also continue to engage in public settings. We're ramping up TIP-SAC meetings. I'll say that we had 2 this past year. We're already ramping up for at least one in 2025 and hopefully more. And we're also thinking bigger picture with TIP-SAC. As you can see by the latest one that we had, it's not just product specific. We also had some dialogue on consumer perception studies for the MRTP pathway more generally, and we're hopeful that TIP-SAC can be used for those broader level scientific questions in the future. We also have started doing public meetings. We did have one on the PMTA process earlier this year, and I'm hopeful that those will be something routinely done by the center, and not only application review, but also in other topics as well, including enforcement. So now the third area, speaking of which, is compliance and enforcement, an area that gets quite a bit of attention. As a reminder, we have authority to regulate manufacturing, marketing, and sale of these products across 4 different entities in the supply chain, from manufacturers to retailers. We continue to take action across that front, but we're also continuing to work on transparency. And so you've seen a ramped up web presence in terms of making sure we're clear about not only the actions we're taking, but what people need to do to comply comply with the law. And that includes not only retailers, but others across the supply chain. And we also, in our goal towards transparency, recently updated our compliance check outcomes database to make it more user-friendly and also to enhance the content that's included. Again, so that we've got readily available point-and-click information for the public as well as others in regulated industry. Aside from that, we also continue to take enforcement and compliance actions. And so this is an overview of what we've done since the center was created 15 years ago, but I will say that we have ramped up activities within the past 2 years, many first-of-their-kind actions, including first injunctions in coordination with the Department of Justice against e-cigarette manufacturers, for civil money penalties against e-cigarette manufacturers, for civil money penalties against retailers, and also first judicial seizures. And so the work that's being done here is going to ramp up, but I can't reinforce enough that there are multiple entities with authorities in this space, and it's critical that everyone takes a role here and makes sure that we maximize our opportunities and collective resources. And that said, this last one in June, when we announced a joint interagency task force, I think is absolutely critical. I get dragged publicly many times for things that are not within our agency's authority. And so it's important for folks to remember that there are multiple entities that have roles and responsibilities in this space, and it's important that we do bring them to the table and that we collectively engage and find solutions. And so that said, with this new task force, I'm very hopeful that we're going to see more momentum here and building on top of some of the great work we've done, including at the border with Customs and Border Protection in terms of seizures. We had a very big seizure at LAX Airport, and there are multiple operations that are underway, and there will be more. But ultimately, we need to make sure things are prioritized and that we collectively work in this space. We also have to be mindful as well as the domestic space, and that's where Department of Justice, U.S. Postal Service, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Federal Trade Commission, and others also serve a very critical role. And so I look forward to engaging with them as we move forward in this space. Now, the fourth area is enhancing knowledge and understanding of the risks associated with tobacco product use. And so as part of this strategic plan, there's 3 key objective areas, and they focus on prevention, cessation, and continuum of risk messaging. And so these are the 3 areas. This was actually an area that was heavily informed by public comment, and I'm sure there's many entities here that participated in the public comment portion, particularly to reinforce that third component, and we've got a lot of developments in that space that will continue in the imminent future. But I want to just briefly touch on those 3 bucket areas in terms of what we've got going. The first is youth prevention. This is and will continue to be a key component of FDA's communication portfolio. The Real Cost Campaign Youth Prevention just turned 10 years old and continues to use a data-driven approach in terms of making sure we are scientifically testing the information before it goes into the field among the target population, and also making sure that we continue to follow the science after implementation through rigorous evaluation. And so that will continue. And we also have had several campaigns that I think are importantly focused on health equity to make sure that we are addressing the full population, particularly those with the greatest impact of these products. We also continue to focus on cessation work, and this will continue. It may even ramp up in the future. We've got a lot of opportunities, including around various rules and guidances for which there will be a prime opportunity for people to quit smoking. That said, we work very closely with our federal partners, including CDC and NIH, particularly National Cancer Institute, but we also engage through our own resources to make sure that we are providing necessary information for folks to quit. We're also ramping up coordination with other centers across FDA. So you may have seen a recent announcement for an interagency meeting convened by FDA and NIH that will be held in October around innovation in the cessation space. This will involve all of the FDA centers with capital here, including CDER, CTP, and also CDRH, but we'll also engage with multiple institutes at the National Institutes of Health. And so I'm very hopeful that will be a productive day-long session to really continue to move the needle forward in terms of innovation in this space. We certainly continue to welcome innovation when it comes to tobacco products, including age-gating technology when it comes to e-cigarette, but we also welcome innovation when it comes to cessation products as well. And so in that space, I think we've got profound opportunity that has been largely untapped for quite some time. And we've also continued to work on continuum of risk work. So we've had some developments since we last met. As I noted, we're going to continue to ramp up efforts in this space. One was the release of a new a web page on the relative risks of tobacco products. And so that is a web page that will continue to be updated over time. And that also coincided with a commentary that I wrote with colleagues out of South Carolina at MUSC, highlighting the importance of continuum of risk messaging for healthcare providers. And so there's been two commentaries written, one with general public health framing and the general population, and the second with healthcare providers. And then aside from that, we're also continuing to allocate resources to study this area. And so we did have a notice of funding that was awarded to Johns Hopkins earlier this year, and the goal again is to continue to be data-driven. We want to make sure that we've got science on what is the best messaging, how best is it delivered, and how best is it delivered to the key target audience, which for us is the intended population is adults who smoke, and unintended populations are vulnerable populations, including youth. That said, we're going to follow the science, and we're hopeful that we'll get some key information that can help inform our next steps in terms of where we go in this area. I'll also note that FDA isn't the only entity that can function in this space. And so there's a lot of people that can do research, a lot of people that can throw dollars at research, and a lot of folks who can help move the needle forward on this. And so we continue to engage with other entities, which is why we've done this collaboration with NIH, but there's also others in the non-government sector who I think can step up to the plate here and make sure that we've got evidence-based approaches to maximize impact for this messaging. And then the final one is advancing operational excellence, which you may be thinking, what does that mean? Well, this is really the behind the scenes, the back of the house work that makes sure we're running. I'm very proud that the Center for Tobacco Products has continued to increase in numbers. We're staffing up. We're now nearly at 1,200 staff, which is the highest that we have ever been, and I'm hopeful we'll continue to grow. That said, in order to have more staff, you have to have more resources. And so we've slowly chipped away at some of the impediments to us hiring, including recently getting direct hiring authority in October 2023, which we are working on like gangbusters to bring folks on. But we also continue to have resource challenges, including that we do not collect any user fees for e-cigarettes. This is something that we have been very vocal about for many years. I spoke about it on Capitol Hill within the past couple weeks as well. And the bottom line is that we have a process to collect user fees, and right now we are not collecting any for e-cigarettes. We're occupying 90% of our enforcement and compliance dollars in that space and not collecting any dollars. And so we are asking Congress for parity. And ultimately, we've been very vocal that we'll spend half of that on enforcement and compliance and 25% on application review. And so if we've got more resources, we can dedicate it more on the areas which are important to folks, including many in this room. So with that, here's a summary. If I put you to sleep, you can just pay attention to this, or if your eyes are so far rolled back in the head, bring them back to baseline. First bullet is CTP continues to rigorously implement the 5-year strategic plan. We're continuing to make progress. This is just the beginning. We've got a lot of great things in store, and I'm very hopeful that we continue to chip away and get into a fully regulated marketplace. That said, it's not easy, folks, and tobacco regulation is not for the weary. I certainly didn't take this job for my health. Indeed, it's probably chipped away years from my life. I get sued on a weekly basis, FOIA'd on a daily basis, and insulted on the internet on an hourly basis. And so definitely not a fun gig, but we're doing important work, and we're making inroads, and I'm here to make sure that we continue to chip away at the leading cause of preventable disease and death in this country. And so for CTP's role at FDA, we continue to engage with folks, including stakeholders and others, to make this happen. Everybody serves a role, and it's not just FDA. It's very easy to drag FDA in whatever form you may be in, but there's a variety of entities in the federal government and also outside the government, including regulated industry, many of the people in this room who serve a role here. And so we've got to work together if we want to get to that position, and that includes building rigorous scientific evidence base and being responsible to make sure we're maximizing the impact of these products for public health while minimizing the adverse effect, particularly among youth. And so with that, we're going to continue to do that, and we also remain committed to providing updates on our progress as appropriate. Transparency is something that's very important to me. I hope that you've witnessed some of this over the past couple years. If you haven't, you may need to emerge from whatever cave you were sitting in. But we've been making a lot of progress. We've been doing a lot more press, a lot of engagement on the web, and we try to release at least some statement once a week. to make sure that we're notifying people of what's happening while also building our resources, including our web content, to make sure that we're getting materials into the hands of folks who can benefit from it. That said, is there more that can be done? Absolutely. Are we committed to doing that? Absolutely. But it's going to take a village, and we need everyone to rise to the occasion. So with that, I will close my bureaucratic mouthpiece, and I think we've got about 8 to 10 minutes for hopefully some robust Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to our folks who are organizing, and I think they're going to walk around with a mic. So wonderful. Take it away.
Start at the front here. So if everybody will give Brian a huge round of applause. Who wants to kick us off with questions? Do we have silence?
Oh, come on.
Ah, of course, Clive.
Oh, Clive, you're always good for a question. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Brian. Welcome to Europe.
Thanks.
One estimate is that the number of the proportion of the vape market that has marketing granted orders would be around 7% by volume. Or you might have a different figure, but let's play with that number for the time being. That means 93% of the market is unauthorized. What are your reflections on the causes of that? It can't be a satisfactory situation. It means there's 18 to 20 million American vapors are using products that are mostly unregulated in the way that you define regulation. Is it that they're just deciding what's appropriate for public health on their own and not waiting for FDA? Is it that the process is denying them innovations that are available in the rest of the world that they want to use? Is it something else? Is it just that there's just too low the constriction of the PMTA process is just too tight, the barriers to entry too strong to actually create and meet the demand for legitimate adult demand for vaping products, and that something needs to change, not just on the enforcement side?
Yeah, so appreciate the question, and I do think it's multifactorial in terms of what's contributed to this. One, I think, is just sheer volume. And so when you look at other regulated products, we were saddled with 27 million applications, which is unheard of. And so that sheer volume is going to take time to get through. That said, I'm hopeful we're making progress there. We're 99% through, and again, the goal is to get to that 180-day statutory deadline. That said, I think the other factor is making sure that entities who are submitting applications are meeting the appropriate scientific bar. And we want to make sure that we are abiding by the law and what Congress intended, and so we have a very clear scientific bar. We've issued guidance, and it certainly is possible, but we need industry to step up to the plate and provide the science needed to help meet that bar. And so that said, I think that the sheer volume, coupled with the high necessary scientific bar, and we're not going to jeopardize that, but also the resources and people. And so our center is underfunded given the task. And so we've asked Congress for many years for additional resources, including those for people to review applications and to do enforcement compliance. And so you can't complain that not enough is being done if on the front end you're not allocating resources to effectively do it for an unprecedented marketplace. And so ultimately I think it's a confluence of all those factors, but I do think we have a sufficient scientific bar. We know it can be met, but we just have to make sure that we're rising to the occasion to accomplish that. And so I'm hopeful that together we'll get there to a fully regulated marketplace, but there's no single panacea here. It's going to take multiple levers, but we're moving in the right direction, and I'm hopeful. If I wasn't, I wouldn't stay in this position.
All right, I got one in the back here.
Hi, Dr. King. Dustin Koffler, Green Tank Technologies. What is most important to the CTP in regards to e-cigarette innovations? Is it liquid formulations, heating technologies, or any other specific items?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the question. I'm really a big fan of innovation. As a scientist, of course, I feel very strongly it has to be evidence-based, but I don't think, that you have to stifle innovation by waiting, for perfect to be the enemy of the good. That said, I think there's a few areas where we've seen some good progress in this space, and I think nicotine salts was one of them. Talk about being able to deliver nicotine in an efficient manner to rival what you'd get from a combustible so people could actually replace it. The only problem is that with enhanced efficiency of nicotine, nicotine delivery for adult smokers, you also get higher dependency among kids and nicotine-naive populations. That said, I think anything that squarely focuses on diminishing that risk to kids is a key lever. And so I know that there's some folks in this room, including many who have mentioned around age gating. I think that technology is definitely an area where there's a lot of opportunity. But for me, I think we're continuing to see certain product characteristics that are effective on the e-cigarette front for helping adult smokers transition completely or significantly reduced, which is a really key lever if you want to get that benefit over risk. But then the risk is really that youth piece. So if you want to tip the scale even further, efforts that are going to mitigate that youth access and use are really going to be key. And that said, I do think that the age gating is really a critically important one in addition to others. But I'm fully a supporter of innovation, but it's got to be data-driven innovation. And I think that's a key area where industry, particularly many in this room, are doing some good work. And I look forward to seeing more of it, including in the application submissions.
Good morning, Brian. Thanks
Matt.
for the talk. This was great. I was a little surprised to see you not mention NYTS. You guys just released really good data showing that youth vaping numbers have dropped yet again. Also released data on nicotine pouches, which show that their use amongst youth is still very, very low. And again, not saying in the presentation, but also just thinking about the broader sort of communications that come out of CTP. I mean, obviously in 2018, the term youth vaping epidemic was generated from the agency to sort of show the uptick. But I wonder now that we're seeing this sharp decline, why there's not more communication about that. And, sort of, again, a sort of messaging also to adult users that these products can be innovative products that help them get a safer form of nicotine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I certainly appreciate the comment, and if you've got suggestions of better ways to amplify it, I'm all ears. We did a press release, a national press briefing, and I did a national media tour where I sat for 5 hours talking to every acronym and media across the country, and so we definitely do our best to help promote those findings, and I ultimately think it is a good thing. We're 70% lower than we were at the peak. I do think we can go lower. We certainly don't want to rest on our laurels. We see where we are with other products that are lower than the current estimate for e-cigarettes. But bottom line is I've been very vocal that I think it's a monumental public health win. How did that get accomplished? It was coordinated efforts. There was no single panacea there either. But I'm hopeful that it will continue to decline. But to do that, we got to put the pedal to metal on the things we know work. In terms of changing the calculus of application reviews, youth use is still a concern. And so I wouldn't expect some major shift in any of our decision making. Youth use is still too high, and we got to make sure that we don't see any upticks so we're playing whack-a-mole. But bottom line is I think it's good news. On the nicotine pouch front, I think it's good news as well, but it's also slowly upticking. And so I'll just remind folks that let's not revisit the past. And so I think there was some key lessons learned on the e-cigarette front, particularly with regard to youth access and use. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't consider that on the issue of nicotine pouches. There's certainly potential to help adult smokers quit, but again, we're weighing benefits and risks. And so you got to do everything you can to mitigate that youth use. And so I'm very hopeful given the recent lack of change over the past year, but I'm also mindful that we've seen a steady uptick over the past several years. And so what we don't want to do is to see that rise further. And so I think the onus is on all of us, including many of the people in this room, to make sure that we ride that success, continue to see declines in youth use while maximizing the opportunity for adult smokers. And for our part, we're committed to verbalizing that in whatever way is possible. And if folks have suggestions around comms, again, I'm all ears. But I'm traveling 3-4 speaking engagements a week and doing everything we can on press, including a release every week. There's only so much we can do, but definitely open to opportunities for further engagement to maximize our comms impact.
Well, Brian, we're really delighted that you're here with us today. We're going to thank you for making the Gtnf one of those big trips. We have Jazz, and then we have Louie, and then we'll let you take a little bit of a breather while others
Great.
react.
Hey, Jazz, how are you? Good to see you.
Brian, good to see you as well. Good. Thank you for being here in the presentation. Nicotine pouches is a good segue. So I, as a scientist, I've reviewed a lot of the manuscripts as a scientist, peer-reviewed literature. And obviously, I don't have the level of literature that you do, but what I see is a product that is essentially nicotine gum from a perspective of how it delivers, although it delivers better, but in terms of a number of variables. other than the fact that you need more money and more people to review, and you've obviously done denials and you've reviewed millions and millions of products, but the products that, that need the PMTA, it's taking a while. I think the pouches have been submitted about 4 years ago. Is there a reason other than not having enough money in reviewers to get them sort of authorized?
Nope, that's it.
Yeah,
We'll
nice.
get to it, but we
All
don't
right,
have the
I'm
resources
going to
to
send
do
you
it.
a check. What do you need?
So 114 million is what we've requested from Congress.
Oh, we'll
So,
get that from someone
yeah,
else then.
Yeah.
Matt Holman will send it. Matt over there.
Yes. We may have to downgrade the next conference. Everyone can chip in. We can be at the Best Western in Montana, and we'll use the added resources for CTP. Okay, next question.
Dr. King, my name is Luis Sanchez, Greenbots. We have developed a fully biodegradable, plant-based, water-dispersing substrate with the aim to replace cigarette filter, which is based on cellulose acetate, which is a single-use plastic, which is the #1 most littered item in the world. My question to you is CTP currently considering a biodegradable solution to replace a #1 most littered item in the world that impacts USA? And if not, why not?
Yeah, it's not currently a priority for us. I'll say that we've got multiple things and limited staff and finite resources, and that currently is not a priority for us.
Okay. Well, Dr. King, thank you. As always, I'm glad we didn't have you in the Best Western today. We can arrange that if you want. We can get you over there.
I don't need a New York Times article, thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thanks.